important topic for you today. The topic, the right to a healthy environment, human rights due diligence for business. Before introducing you to my colleagues who will be speaking today, and before giving you a short overview on what to expect from this webinar today, I just quickly want to share some technical notes with you so that everyone gets to enjoy this webinar without any technical issues. So as you can see, here are our technical notes. During the event, participants are automatically muted, cameras are turned off. If you experience any technical issues, please send a private chat message to Helpdesk WIMR. My colleague Nele is behind this address and will be happy to assist you. We generally recommend downloading the WebEx app in case of audio issues. Usually that works better than using the browser. We have a Q&A session planned towards the end of the webinar. Please ask any content-related questions throughout the webinar in the chat, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session. If we don't have time, please send your questions via email, or we get back to you. And last but not least, this event will be recorded, and you will automatically receive the recording and the slides shown here today after the presentation via email. So that's it for the technical part. Now let's get to the topic. So first of all, let me give you a brief overview of the organizations behind this webinar. So this webinar is a joint webinar by the UN Global Compact, who will be represented today by Saskia Beer, Human Rights Manager, and Joan Verisk, Senior Human Rights Manager. Maybe you can also just quickly turn on your cameras so that the participants can see you. Next to UN Global Compact, we have Verisk Maplecroft, represented by Christina Smith, Business and Human Rights Consultant, and we have the German Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights, represented by me, Jessica Kruse. I'm an advisor on Business and Human Rights as well. I don't want to get into the details of these organizations today because we want to focus on the right to a healthy environment. But if you have any questions about us, please let us know in the chat, or you can also find our contact details at the end of the presentation, and feel free to contact us anytime. So we have organized this webinar today because these three organizations, UN Global Compact, Verisk Maplecroft, and the German Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights, have been working together on the Business and Human Rights Navigator for a few years now. Some of you might be familiar with the Business and Human Rights Navigator, some of you won't, but don't worry, we will get into that. But let's have a look at the agenda for today first. I will tell you a little bit more about the Navigator soon. Afterwards, Christina and Saskia will introduce to you our newly launched issue, Right to a Healthy Environment, Human Rights Due Diligence, a Practical Guide for Business, which is the reason we are all here today. Then we have organized a panel discussions with experts on that topic, which will be moderated by Joan, who will also introduce our amazing panelists later on. And finally, we have time for the Q&A session. Okay, so let's get into it. I think we can all agree on that quote shown here: the health of our planet and the health of its people are inextricably linked. So for the full enjoyment of human rights, a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is essential. Therefore, we, UN Global Compact, Verisk Maplecroft, and the German Helpdesk, have decided to develop a new issue for the Business and Human Rights Navigator, focusing on exactly that topic, and to help companies better understand and address the connection between environment and human rights, because we understand it's still a bit, might be a bit difficult to grasp the connection. And before diving into that topic, let me ask you our first question for today, so that we can get to know our audience a little better. So the first question being, have you ever heard of the Business and Human Rights Navigator? Feel free to scan the QR code that leads you to Slido, and then you can choose your answer. It's okay if you choose no. We will get to the Business and Human Rights Navigator in a second. If you are joining this webinar on your phone, you can also go to your browser and type in slido.com and use the numbers shown here, 6710785, to put in your answer. Okay, I can see answers coming in. It's mostly people here joining today have not heard of the Business and Human Rights Navigator, but we will change that today, so no worries. Okay, there are a few more yeses coming in. That's great. Okay. Yes. Then, a few more yeses, sorry about that. Let me give you a brief overview of the Navigator now. So the Business and Human Rights Navigator is a guiding tool, a website to guide companies around the world to better understand and address human rights impacts in their operations and supply chains. It is aligned with the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Again, if you have any questions on that, please do not hesitate to contact us. The Business and Human Rights Navigator seeks to help businesses better understand the most common human rights issues that they may come into contact with. And we do that by offering currently thorough information on 11 key issues. We are always developing more issues, such as child labor, discrimination, or as we just launched, the right to a healthy environment. And the Navigator also offers a database with practical examples to learn how other companies have identified and adapted successful strategies and solutions. And we're always looking for more practical examples to give you insights into best practices. So the website is just really worth to check out. You see the link down below. Feel free to browse through the Business and Human Rights Navigator anytime. As I just mentioned, we have published 11 key issues at the moment. Each issue includes an overview of human rights risks related to that issue, risk factors for key industries, suggestions on how to incorporate that issue, how to deal with that issue in your due diligence process, practical examples, best practices from other companies that are directly linked with that issue, and you will also get a list of recommended resources to further dive into that topic. The same structure goes for our newly launched key issue, Right to a Healthy Environment. I'm very happy to announce this issue in this webinar today. We have put a lot of work into developing the issue to give a practical guide for business on how to deal with that topic in the human rights due diligence processes. And I'm also very happy to announce that this is the first issue that we can also present to you as a PDF that you can download and share with your colleagues. You will see a QR code later on that leads you straight to the website and to the issue. And let me ask you one more question, since you have all registered for today's session, before diving into the issue and into the topic of the right to a healthy environment. What do you think the right to a healthy environment covers? Again, feel free to scan the QR code or join with the browser. Just a few words is fine. There are no wrong answers. Do you have any ideas or any expectations for today? And then we can have a look at it and start diving into the topic. I can see people typing, which is great. And I will just wait a few seconds. Okay, so what do you think the right to a healthy environment covers? So we see clean water and air, clean air, access to clean water, drinking water, no pollution, also relating to clean air. Environmental protection as a human right. Good point. Oh, so many more coming in. Biodiversity, security, sustainable land usage. Yeah, so many great words coming in. Thank you for participating. And now let's see what our issue is about. And I will hand over to Christina, who will present to you the right to a healthy environment.
Jess, I believe you're covering this slide.
Sorry?
Oh, that's fine. We're on the correct slide. Apologies. Okay. Thank you, Jessie. So I will now take you all through definitions of and legal instruments on the right to a healthy environment. And then I'll just take a brief look at the contextual and industry-specific risk factors before we turn over to Saskia for due diligence recommendations, which is really a crucial part of this guidance. So all people have the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Now, this right has been in discussions and in consideration since the 1972 Stockholm Declaration on the Human Environment, which declared that people have a fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. Now, the right to a healthy environment as we know it today looks a little bit different, but it really endorses the almost global recognition of that link between environmental harm and human rights. And much of the case law out there argues that many human rights, including things like right to life, right to health, water, property, all depend on a healthy environment to be upheld. It's generally accepted that this right applies to both present and future generations, and is a specific right to ensuring that people have a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment to live and work in. Now, it's a little bit cheeky to say definition, because there is no universally agreed definition on the right to a healthy environment, nor is there a universally applicable threshold. But it is understood to protect, among other rights, an individual's right to clean air, many of you said that, a safe and stable climate, access to safe water and adequate sanitation. Safe water, I think, was also mentioned, healthy and sustainably produced food, non-toxic environments in which to live, work, study and play, and healthy biodiversity and ecosystems. Now, this right is often explained as a twofold right, with both substantive, so those ones that are on the left hand of the screen that I just outlined, and procedural elements, which are designed to enable access to information and participatory decision-making, to provide redress for harm, and secure the free exercise of these rights. Companies should definitely consider these procedural elements when engaging with stakeholders on the right to a healthy environment. The two really do go hand in hand. Now, since the Stockholm Declaration, this has been appearing more and more frequently in national constitutions, in regional legislation, and in policy documents. The most significant is the UN General Assembly's 2022 resolution, which recognized the human right to a healthy environment. And although this resolution is not binding, it did signify a global step towards recognizing this right, and is really why we've started thinking about this as an issue and why we pulled together this issue for the website and the publication. Other international policies and kind of frameworks have also taken note of this right. You have the Paris Agreement, and we also have the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, in which the principle of a safe and healthy working environment was adopted as the fifth fundamental principle and right at work, again in 2022. That was a crucial year. So this means that occupational safety and health can no longer be considered an optional extra for companies. And this principle is particularly relevant to the prevention of heat stress as a consequence of climate crises in places like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the prevention of toxic working environments in the context of the right to a healthy environment. Regional legislation has also affirmed this right in many human rights charters and conventions across the world, including the African Charter on Human and People's Rights of 1981, the Arab Charter of Human Rights of 2004, and the San Salvador Protocol to the American Convention on Human Rights of 1988. The EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, of which I'm sure many of you know and are probably tired of hearing about, but it also references the right to a healthy environment. And it prohibits causing any measurable environmental degradation that substantially impairs societal needs, including food, clean water, facilities, ecosystem services, and access to land. And it's just worth noting, really, that although it's not mentioned in the guidance, as it only happened last week on the 3rd of July, but the Inter-American Court of Human Rights did also affirm the right to a healthy environment and said for the first time that this includes the right to a stable climate. So this is another step in the right direction. So now, if we move to contextual and industry-specific risk factors, many of these are detailed further in the publication. First, moving to contextual risk factors, I'm just going to wait for the slide to move on. There we go. Nope, one too far. There we go. So first, contextual risk factors. Environmental damage by corporate activities can often arise to such an extent that it impacts human rights. And companies, of course, should take responsibility for their own environmental and human rights impacts. But there are certain risk factors, those shown on the left of your screen there, that increase the likelihood of corporate environmental damage being so severe it starts to impact or restrict human rights. So these include climate change and climate-related disasters, a lack of access to justice, poorly enforced domestic environmental laws, few environmental protections in those countries, resource-rich areas, poverty, and conflict. Now, for the purposes of today, I'm just going to focus very briefly on a couple of those. The guidance does go into a lot more detail on these. So first of all, a lack of access to justice due to poorly funded or corrupt judiciaries really prevents affected victims from accessing remedy when environmental damage has occurred. And this restricts the procedural rights of individuals, so those I mentioned, rights to redress for harm or access to information, and prevents the possibility of redress to those impacted by the environmental damage. Poverty also exacerbates the effects communities feel from environmental damage. So if we take a poor rural community whose local water source is polluted by toxic wastewater, they'll be unlikely to have the funds to fix the damage. They might have challenges accessing necessary legal protections or legal representation, or they might not have access to local healthcare to resolve any resulting health issues. Those sorts of communities also tend to rely more heavily on their local water source for cooking and cleaning, and often for their income too, so for things like fishing and agriculture. There are also particular groups who are most vulnerable to violations of the right to a healthy environment, and companies should seek to consider these when carrying out due diligence around these rights. The UN resolution for the right to a healthy environment, as I mentioned, that affirmed the right in 2022, specifically mentions the following vulnerable groups to be considered. You can see those on the right of the slide. So those are indigenous and traditional communities, children, older persons, persons with disabilities, women and girls, and environmental defenders. Now, I'm just going to briefly take indigenous and traditional communities. These face increased pressure from governments, and companies seeking to exploit resources on their ancestral lands. These lands are materially and culturally significant to these communities, and their connection to the land is intrinsically linked to their rights. Such communities are frequently marginalized from decision-making processes, thus restricting their procedural rights under the right to a healthy environment and risking the violation of their substantive rights. Furthermore, Indigenous communities are far more vulnerable and less resilient towards adverse environmental impacts because they are disproportionately affected by poverty, marginalisation and discrimination. And they are therefore at greater risk of carrying out dangerous work or being in precarious employment. Now, if we turn to my final slide, industry-specific risk factors, I think we've gone one too far. I'm going to go back again. There we are. So whilst restrictions on the right to a healthy environment are present in a lot of industries, you have transport, you have construction, you have technology, the industries on the left of the screen now present particularly significant levels of risk. That's not to say that the other industries shouldn't consider that, but we've just highlighted these four within the guidance. So you have agriculture, mining and the extractives industry, consumer goods, so any goods purchased by an end user, there's no intention of those being used later to produce something else. And that might be clothing, that might be technology, so things like electronics, computers. It might be white goods like kitchen appliances. And then the last industry is renewable energy. These industries and their related risk factors are outlined a lot more in the publication, but again, I'm just going to highlight one. I'm going to just look at renewable energies quickly as it relates to just transition, which we've highlighted on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, as the world seeks to reduce its environmental footprint by trying to move away from fossil fuels and turn instead to alternative renewable energy sources, that would hopefully result in less greenhouse gas emissions, reduce climate change and air pollution impacts, and better protect the people and the planet. Therefore, better protect the right to a healthy environment. Wind, solar, nuclear, hydrogen energy are all considered alternatives. However, despite the benefits, manufacturing, the construction, the maintenance can often be associated with adverse impacts that might then impact the local communities and restrict their rights. So if we just look at one risk factor within this sector, critical metals and minerals, and I'm sure that you're all aware that there's a surging demand for these minerals for things like copper, lithium, cobalt, iron, and they're all driving that green energy transition. But the mining and refining of these minerals can heavily damage the environment, and local communities are often impacted by various types of pollution from these mines. You've got noise, air, water pollution, you've got soil degradation, deforestation, biodiversity loss, excessive land and water use, and water scarcity. And all of these might disrupt a person's ability to live and or work healthily and safely in an environment. Now, related to this issue is that of just transition, as I mentioned. As climate change drives the long-term shifts in the planet's weather patterns and temperatures, I don't know if anyone here is from Europe, but we've been having quite a long heat wave at the moment. Massive changes to the way our economies are built are required. This means transitioning to renewable energies, so that sector that I mentioned just now, and promoting sustainable economies and societies to reduce carbon emissions to below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels in such a way that won't leave anybody behind. Now, that's the basic concept of a just transition, but the transition strategies of states and by extension companies should respect human rights, promote sustainable development, create work and quality jobs, and eradicate poverty. So companies seeking to transition to low carbon creation and use should consider how such a transition may impact the rights of communities and individuals, in particular to the right to a healthy environment. And I'm going to turn now to Saskia to discuss due diligence requirements.
Thanks, Christina. And so good afternoon or good morning to everyone on this call. My name is Saskia Bear. I'm Human Rights Manager for the UN Global Compact. And so we've just heard kind of what the right to a healthy environment is, how important it is. And in the next few minutes, we'll be turning to what companies can actually do to put this right into practice. So essentially, we will walk you, or I will walk you through what is called the Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence process, which of course is outlined in the report that Jessie mentioned at the outline of this webinar. So you can think of this as a kind of a clear roadmap for companies to make sure that companies are not unintentionally causing any harm to people or the planet. And it's not entirely new. We are essentially building on existing human rights guidelines and covering or making sure that we also cover the environmental considerations we just discussed, because a healthy environment and healthy people, of course, go hand in hand. And so the 6 main steps, which we will walk through very briefly today, and then we'll pick up in the discussions in the panel, are outlined on this slide here. So this is, first of all, making a public promise. So this is the policy commitment. 2, checking for risks. So assessing the impacts. Then 3, taking action. And then 4, keeping an eye on progress. So tracking performance. And then 5, communicating that both internally as well as externally. And then finally, making sure that there's a process in place whereby essentially affected communities or people have a chance to make their concerns heard and to put any wrongs into the right. So this is the remedy and grievance mechanism. One thing not outlined in this slide, but we'll come back to it again and again as we go through the steps, is the importance of stakeholder engagement at each step within this process to make sure that the voices of those who are affected are essentially heard. So going through one by one, developing a policy commitment, as with most promises, it helps putting it down in writing and articulating this very clearly. And this is where leadership is extremely important, and having a strong policy commitment can really, essentially, it's not just words on a paper, but this can really have a big impact on the operational strategy of a company, how it operates, as well as how it makes plans for the future. In practice, a policy on human rights and environmental due diligence should include the main issues a company has identified, and this will be industry specific, it will be company specific. And if you already have a human rights policy in place, then you probably want to make sure that it includes the right to a healthy environment, which of course is a human right in its own right. It may also have impacts operationally. So ideally, we'd want to move away from the human rights teams or the social teams in a company, as well as the environmental teams working in silos. And we've seen good examples where both teams essentially report to one strategic head to ensure that there's this oversight of both the social as well as the environmental due diligence aspects. I probably won't go into all of these details, but I think one thing I do just want to point out here again is the importance of the rights holders' perspective. So essentially, as a company, by actively asking for and listening to and using feedback received from stakeholders, this can really help guide a company's actions and ensuring that the policy is robust in what it aims to achieve. So that's the first step. Second step is, of course, assessing the potential and actual impacts. So this is looking for the company to essentially consider what they do, i.e. their operations and how their products are made from start to finish, and prioritizing any risks that might be identified. So if we look at human rights and environmental due diligence, they're essentially kind of 2 elements. So first of all, there is the importance of assessing the potential human rights impacts, then the actual human rights impacts, and how the environmental, potential negative environmental impacts link with any interconnected human rights impacts. The UN guiding principles for business and human rights, which are kind of the foundational legislation for this process, are quite pragmatic. So there is a sense of prioritizing where a company should focus its resources in order to address any impacts that it identifies. So taking these one by one, if we go into the potential and actual impacts, this is essentially to identify that, first of all, it is important to consider what we call the local, or what can be called the local ecosystem. So what are the main environmental issues, or what is the context that the company might be operating in? Again, this will depend on the industry, it will depend on the geography, and it will depend on the specifics on a case-by-case basis. And just by way of reminder, of course, when we speak of these environmental impacts, what we're really referring to are all elements of the triple planetary crisis. So these can relate to impacts on the climate, they can relate to impacts on pollution, and they can relate to potential impacts on biodiversity loss. I think all of which have been you identified at the beginning when we asked you what this would cover. And then the second aspect of this assessment is, of course, the actual impact assessment. So this is at a company level, i.e., what are the impacts, both from an environmental point of view, as well as any potential human rights linkages that might be ongoing that the company should be aware of. And here, good data is really key to making this assessment and being as precise as possible. And then once we've done this, a company, of course, then needs to decide on where it focuses its efforts, and this is where the prioritization comes in. So the two factors that we consider, if you think of it in terms of a matrix or in terms of two factors, are the likelihood, i.e., how probable is it that an event or that an operation might have a negative impact, and then how serious is it, or how severe is it? And when we speak about severity, there are essentially three elements that go into that, and three questions that a company can ask itself. So one is, how many people are affected by a potential environmental harm? So that's the scope. How much does the impact harm the people affected? So that is the scale. And then three, how easy is it to fix the situation? And how or what can be done to get things back to normal, if you will, for those who are affected. So that is the remediability of it. And all these three elements go into the severity or into the seriousness of a potential environmental or human rights harm. So once you've assessed the risks, you've prioritized them, then of course it gets into the actual positive change. So this is where companies can use the information that they have and make decisions on how to stop or lessen any kind of negative impact and how they can make positive change. And when deciding on these actions, it will there are a number of factors that will play into it, and we've outlined them on the slide here. But the first thing to consider, of course, is how will any action that I take or that a company takes actually stop or reduce the harm, and how effective will this be? So this is the effectiveness bucket. The other point to consider is the degree of involvement. So as a company, are you causing or are you contributing to the human rights, potential human rights harm, or are you simply linked to them? And obviously, the more direct the causation is, the more active or more proactive a company needs to be. So, for example, if a mining company does not use good equipment and there is, say, toxic chemicals are leaking into the soil, which then has negative impacts on local communities' health, that is the mining company's direct operations, if you are the mining company. So you should be looking at these issues very, very seriously. The other points to consider are the leverage. So this is particularly relevant where perhaps it is not in your direct operations, as I just outlined, but perhaps the issues are with a supplier who you are buying from. And in those cases, it will, of course, depend on how much influence you can have over the supplier, and to be creative about using that either through your commercial transactions, perhaps by entering into dialogue with the supplier, perhaps entering into partnerships even with other organizations to see if the situation can be improved. And then finally, as I said, I would be coming back to this point again and again. The rights holder engagement is so crucial when deciding what actions to take. And it is very important to have individuals who are affected by negative human rights risks to be active participants in finding solutions. Because what we've seen in practice is that in those cases, these actions are often the most effective and most purposeful. And of course, these are not one-off steps. So this is where the tracking performance comes in. In a way, all these steps kind of interrelate with each other, but part of the due diligence process is, of course, to set targets in order to measure what a company is doing to prevent any human rights abuses or environmental degradation that could lead to human rights abuses. And so these are KPIs that the company can set themselves, can set for itself, as well as smart targets. So they might relate to, say, the percentage of contracts that include enforceable human rights clauses. These might include the number of operations or sites that have been covered by a human rights impact assessment, and are really there to essentially keep a company on track as it is reviewing its due diligence, human rights and environmental due diligence process. And as part of that process, communication is key. Communication is, of course, a core part of running a responsible business. And this applies both to internal stakeholders. So these are these also includes rights holders that might be impacted by the company's operations. And it's very helpful here to have an open line of communication. It helps build trust and essentially makes sure that companies are accountable to those who are most impacted. And then in addition to that, of course, we have the external communication piece, which often takes the form in publicly shared formal reports. And what we are seeing now is that these do include both the human rights as well as the environmental aspects, and ideally should outline how a company is protecting the right to a healthy environment. This also allows other stakeholders, such as nonprofits, investors, governments, to hold companies to account and to measure the progress that companies are making in this domain. And then finally, and then we would have covered all of them in a very brief way, but I think it helps set the scene. Of course, this relates to Pillar 3 of the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And it's, of course, very important that people are able to get solutions, and there are ways for them to communicate if things have gone wrong. So within the remedy and grievance mechanism, there are kind of 3 points that are particularly important. So one is that a good complaint system is essential, and it is hugely important in helping to fix any kind of human rights issues, often functioning as an alert system before it gets too bad. And we've seen innovative ways of companies doing exactly that in having a way, for example, for workers to have their voices heard, even if they're in quite remote places. Then the second bucket here is remediation. So this is a company essentially accepting responsibility for issues that have been identified, either on the environmental side or that have a direct impact on people. And it might not always be easy to fix problems, and so it does require careful handling. But this brings me to the final bucket of affected communities. By ensuring that rights holders' voices are heard in this process as much as possible, that is often one of the most effective ways to getting fair and effective results. So this is it in terms of walking through the 6 steps of the human rights and environmental due diligence process. And as you think about what we've discussed so far, we'd just like to hear from you. And the question for you today, if you haven't already used Slido, if you have, you should be able to reactivate it, either by using the QR code or by typing slido.com into your browser. But the question we have for you is, based on what you have heard, which due diligence action would you prioritize for your company to protect the right to a healthy environment? So there are no right or wrong answers as such. This really will depend on where you are. If you are a company on the progress of your human rights and environmental due diligence journey, as we say, all of these steps, the 6 steps that we've outlined, are important for an effective human rights and environmental due diligence process. But we do just want to hear from you if there are any kind of key parts within those steps that have felt particularly important to you, or where you feel you might want to make improvements to based on what you've heard today. So we've had some answers coming in. So strong policy with company commitment, that's wonderful. I think if you have a strong policy with leadership buy-in, that's a very, very powerful tool. The inclusion of affected communities, I think that's one of those so important elements and not always easy. So it's great to work with proxies as well. Trainings to improve the human rights and environmental due diligence awareness, of course, tracking and performance and assessing impact. So I actually see that almost all the steps were identified, perhaps with the exception of grievance mechanisms. Okay, thank you for that. With that, I will hand over to Joan Verica, who's the Senior Manager for Human Rights at the UN Global Compact, and who will be moderating our panel discussion today. Over to you, Joan.
Thank you very much, Saskia. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you, colleagues, as well, Jessie and Christina, for that rich and thought-provoking foundation. And now, panelists, I welcome you here, and I welcome all participants to this next segment of the webinar. I'm delighted and honored to moderate a panel today, who I will introduce shortly. You see their faces on the screen there. We've just heard about how the right to a healthy environment has gained recognition in international law, and how expectations are evolving for businesses to align with this right, and not just in theory, but also in practice. And now we shift our focus towards practical experiences and insights from experts. This is the fun part. We want to learn from our panelists how the UN guiding principles breathe life to corporate responsibility to respect the right to a healthy environment. I'm now going to introduce our 3 speakers who have deep experience and diverse perspectives from business, from the Helpdesk, and from the United Nations. I hope that after this panel, all participants here, you will have some knowledge about moving from knowledge to commitment, and then to actual implementation to respect this right in your business. Our first panelist is David Picker. David works as an advisor at the Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights. This is a helpdesk of the German government, where he primarily assists companies in implementing environmental and climate-related due diligence processes within their supply chains. David holds a background in biology and environmental sciences, and he has gained professional experience in corporate environmental management and international development cooperation. Thanks for being with us, David. We will also hear from our second speaker, Marina Liel. Marina is the head of human rights at Natura & Co., leading strategies focused on human rights due diligence, traceability, development, and inequality and climate justice. Previously, Marina worked in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, monitoring and analysis, and business internalization, with experience at companies such as L'Oreal and Deutsche Telekom. She's also a founding member of TISFD, that's a task force on inequalities and social financial disclosures, and an advisor in living wage program for Brazilian Global Compact. Marina holds a degree in international relations with a master's in human rights. Welcome, Marina. And then I'll briefly introduce Olga Nilova. Olga is a business and human rights specialist responsible for developing and implementing the UNGPs programming on business and human rights at the global level, with a focus on business respect for the right to a healthy environment. Olga has over 10 years experience as a human rights specialist with the UN Development System. And before joining UNDP Governance, Rule of Law and Peacebuilding Hub in Geneva, Olga worked with OHCHR and the UN Resident Coordinators Offices in Southeast Asia. Now we'll hear from each speaker and then we'll open the floor to your questions. As you listen, I encourage you to think about what resonates in your own context and where your organization might push further. If you have questions, participants, please post them in the chat and feel free to indicate the speaker you would like to direct your question to. Without further ado, I'd love to now welcome you, David. Thanks for being here. I'll start with you. David, with your rich experience at the Helpdesk and engagement with businesses in Germany and beyond, how have you seen companies take environmental issues into consideration when looking at human rights risks? And what are some key, perhaps, challenges for companies when they're trying to identify the human rights impacts of environmental damage? Over to you, David. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Joanne. Well, first of all, for having me. It's a pleasure for me to be a part of this panel and to give my insights on this very important topic. But to get to your question, from the perspective of the Helpdesk Business and Human Rights, so we do see actually more and more companies acknowledging the strong interconnection between environmental issues and human rights risks. And we see here and there that environmental considerations are increasingly integrated in human rights due diligence processes, for example, by including environmental dimensions in risk mapping procedures for human rights. But of course, and that's why I'm here and what I'm here to talk about, there are still some major challenges for this integration. And one of the key challenges in this integration that we see very often is the lack of effective cross-departmental collaboration, particularly between human rights officers and environmental officers within the company. So one reason for that is that, or could be that these functions, they often operate with different frameworks, they set different priorities, they have different expertise. The ones of you who maybe have a background in nature science or engineering, they know that they speak a different language. So, and I would say there is still not enough understanding that when talking about environmental issues and social issues, that it's actually two sides of the same coin. We see that environmental teams, they tend to focus more on technical metrics, such as, for instance, greenhouse gas emissions or waste production, while human rights teams, they focus on social impacts primarily, like child labor, living wages, labor safety, gender-based discrimination, or also freedom of association. We do see that this, I would even call it like some sort of artificial separation. It creates some blind spots in the risk assessment process, specifically when engaging with relevant stakeholders, which is, as Saskia already mentioned, is a crucial part of every due diligence process. So But of course, there are still some other major challenges that include the complex causal relationships between environment and human rights related issues. Environmental damage, for example, often leads to human rights harms in a more indirect and delayed ways, which makes it difficult to really trace accountability. So in order to address this challenge, or one possible solution could be that companies, first of all, better understand these complex relationships, and that they can also use environmental data, which is often already there in the company, and this data could be integrated in the human rights risk assessment process. But there are other challenges as well, like legal challenges. Some jurisdictions, they already recognize this linkage between human rights and the environment, such as the German Due Diligence Supply Chain Act. For example, the German Supply Chain Act, the LKSG, it prohibits environmentally harmful practices that may negatively impact human rights. Other legal frameworks that we work with, they do not explicitly address this linkage, like, for example, the EU deforestation regulation. So, I mean, somewhat it's in this regulation, but not really explicitly. And last but not least, a lot of companies, they use software tools to support their due diligence process. And of course, those tools, they also have limitations because the existing risk assessment tools, they are not designed to identify those cross-cutting environmental and human rights risks altogether. So to conclude on this first question, in our view and from our experience, without a strong collaboration structure, these interconnected impacts, such as, for example, pollution leading to violations of the right to health or water, are often not fully captured. And to overcome these barriers, companies are recommended to develop a shared accountability mechanism between the different departments, for example, human rights and the environmental department. And they should invest in an integrated risk assessment approach, which also includes, of course, the meaningful stakeholder engagement on these interlinked impacts and issues. So thank you very much, John.
Thank you very much, David. You've really touched on very important points there. I really appreciate that. And, you know, this idea of the technical interfunctional collaboration and peer-to-peer exchange within companies that understandably is quite difficult. And what you talked about, interoperability of different regulations, and especially when it pertains to human rights and environment. But thanks so much for emphasizing that collaboration, I think, will be key. And you know, and idea of integrating data and building more infrastructure to do so. So thank you very much, David. I'll happily now move over to you, Marina. It's such a pleasure to have you here from Natura & Co. The company, of course, has a long-standing human rights commitment, producing beauty products in Brazil and with global operations as well. Your company sources raw materials from the Amazon, the world's largest tropical rainforest and famed for its biodiversity. Marina, how does Natura approach its responsibility to respect the right to a healthy environment? Could you tell us if you conduct human rights and due diligence with that environmental lens, and what steps you have taken to address any issues that have been identified and prioritized, as Saskia informed us earlier? Over to you, Marina. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, everyone. It was an honor to be here as well. I'm Marina Liu. I'm head of human rights for Natura. Natura, it's a Brazilian-based cosmetic company, very deeply rooted in the Amazon, as you said, Joanne, sourcing and dealing with over 50 communities in the Amazon. It's an honor and it's a responsibility to be here representing the corporate side of this conversation. I was telling Joanne and Saskia early before that we are still learning on the curve of learning. So there's a lot to do. We do a lot of things, but there's a lot to be done. But what we do, I think the first step we took was policy, put it in the policy. So the right to a healthy environment is one of our salient human rights, especially because we are so rooted in the Amazon and biomes and biodiversity, and has a long-standing climate operations. So this was a no-brainer when it comes to our salient human rights. So it is put there as a salient human right. So we do that in our entire human rights due diligence. But I would say that we started this journey in a very unorthodox way, maybe, because we started this when we created what we call IPNL, our integrated profit and loss. So we started this journey actually looking at our impacts. So in this IPNL, I'll put the link here and you can research on your own. We calculate our impact on natural, social, and human capital. And when it comes to natural capital, we calculate, for example, the impact pollutions or water treatment have on society. So how much impacts positive or negatively everything we do in natural capital, and how much it increases or decreases the value of our share. So the idea is that companies should be evaluated and assessed not only by their share value, but also by their impact on all those capitals. So we started actually all this journey on the right to the healthy environment on the impact lenses rather than the risks. And I really like what David said, that the people and company, we do have different lenses, and using the data we already have, but putting in different lenses, it's something we should be done. And the third step we did, aside from policy, IPNL, was taking the knowledge and the data we have in climate, for example, TCFD. What we did is knowing TCFD data, which is risks for the climate change. So what will happen with the company if we go to 1.5 or 2 degrees? Then we see the physical risk of the company. What we did as before, my company is impacted by water scarcity or floods, the entire city will be impacted by this. So we cross data, TCFD data with social data in every community we work in. So now we have what we call our social climate vulnerability index. Then we can see the communities we operate in, what's their vulnerability regarding climate change and resilience and adaptation to climate change and climate justice. And I think the fourth thing that I want to share with you, and again, what we did, actually, honestly, I will be very straightforward with you. Things we already have in climate, things we already had in human rights, we put our heads together and we started doing what we could actually, what human rights lenses could be put in climate process, and what climate lenses could be put in human rights process. That's what we did. So the fourth program we did, we have a climate transition plan. So what we'll do for carbon footprint and so on. And one of the huge chunks part of this climate transition plan is climate justice and just transition. So it's not only about reducing carbon footprint, but also helping adaptation, resilience in the supply chain, and resilience to the entire community. I think what guides us in the entire part of the right to a healthy environment is the right to the safe and stable climate. So this for us is very big. It's not only about building resilience, building remediating our impact, but actually having a joint conjunctions, having a joint effort to create a safe and stable climate to everyone that is related to our company in general. So just so you know, in our company in general, we have around 8 million resellers around the world, 4 million in Latin America, and we work with over 50 communities in the Amazon. So it's a very, how do you say this? We are in every city in Brazil, for example. So I can't only look to 1 or 2 cities. I have to look to the entire ecosystem. So more or less, this is what we do. We're still learning and changing and exchanging to other companies. I would love to hear if anyone else has other experiences. I'll put on the chat, because I would love to exchange and see what you guys are doing as well. So I think that's an overview, Joanne.
Fantastic, Marina. Thank you so much. What a rich experience and a context of the type of work you're doing. Really appreciate you being open with the information you've shared, including speaking about novel ways that most of the time we're training about using the risk-based approach, and that's what the UN Guiding Principles is actually calling for, is to really look and pay attention to risks, and then human rights risks, the lens on people. And of course, integrating the environmental lens to understand the impacts on people. But very interesting to hear about the impact approach, about that integrated P&L, very interesting. I think we'll appreciate seeing, and we will share with participants any links that you mentioned there. Thank you again. I'll move over quickly now to you, Olga, and it's really great to have you on our panel. Olga, with your extensive work at the UNDP, what would you say, and with the UN generally, what would you say, why do you think the recognition of the right to a healthy environment is so crucial at this moment in time? And how can companies better protect this right? Over to you, Olga.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today on behalf of UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme. As Christina presented earlier today, in 2021, the UN Human Rights Council and later the UN General Assembly in 2022 recognized a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. And this legally affirmed the direct connections between healthy environment, human dignity, and human rights. And I wanted to highlight 3 reasons why this recognition, the recognition of this right, is critical, but not in general, but critical for businesses, for our audience today. So firstly, this recognition clarified responsibilities of businesses under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So the ratification made it unequivocal that businesses should now respect the right to a healthy environment, alongside all other internationally recognized human rights, right to health, right to life, right to water, among many others. So this means that they need to integrate the right to healthy environment, as Saskia explained, to a human rights policy commitment. Businesses need to integrate the right to healthy environment into human rights due diligence process and remediation processes as well. So now it's crystal clear under the UNGPs, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is one of other internationally recognized human rights, which means businesses are expected to respect. So secondly, the ratification, the recognition of this right leveled the playing field. Many companies were already taking steps to address environmental impacts. For example, through very well-known environmental impact assessment. We know, and I think Christina mentioned it, over 100 jurisdictions, states had enacted laws and policies on a healthy environment in different forms, long before the UN resolutions, long before the right to healthy environment was recognized. However, the global recognition of the right to healthy environment has harmonized expectations to businesses, including inspiring regional legislation, very well known, like the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which now requires targeted companies to assess and disclose risks to both human rights and the environment. So the expectations are now harmonized and very clear. Human rights need to be respected alongside the environment, and environment is one of those internationally recognized human rights. So thirdly, and finally, the recognition of the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment started to break down internal silos that David and Marina were talking about. So the recognition has brought human rights teams and environmental teams, often working separately, as previous speakers were talking about, closer together. this E and S brought together the global level and the legal system started to come together inside the companies, because now there is a right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And I just wanted to highlight that this collaboration benefits not only affected individuals, as Saskia was presenting before, and communities affected by companies, but also businesses themselves, by reducing redundant risk assessments, action plans, separate data collections, data sets, parallel reporting processes. And ultimately, it streamlines due diligence costs and saves time. And I just wanted to support Marina a bit and say that, UNDP also keeps learning, and then, it's also a learning process for us, and the ratification of the right and adoption of the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment made us break down internal silos too. So it's not only for business to break those silos. We also had environmental programming and human rights programming working separately. And since the adoption in 2022, we now have the environmental focal point in the human rights team that works across the environmental team, climate team, waste team, toxics team, etc. So we also try to break down silos internally and keep learning. And it's also not a streamlined process for UNDP yet, similarly to Natura or any other business. So now to your second question, Joanne, very briefly, how can businesses better respect this new right? While easier said than done, to be honest, the key is integrating into human rights due diligence. I think Saskia and Marina mentioned it before. This integration, of course, varies by industry, context, size, ownership of a particular business. But I just wanted to share 3 real-world, examples from UNDP's work, developing a practical tool on human rights due diligence, inclusive of the right to healthy environment. Very quick, real cases. So one company, a mining company that UNDP consulted, shared with us that they identified risks by combining quantitative geospatial data with qualitative insights from affected communities. So they combined 2 data sets. As David mentioned, 2 different data sets and mindsets of 2 different teams were combined to determine what human rights are affected, resulting from environmental harms. And actually to determine whom to consult, what affected communities to consult, that mining company that we reached considered the potential reach of environmental harm beyond the jurisdiction borders. So beyond the state borders that the company operated in. The company also included children in the consultation processes, and not only as rights holders that were affected by immediate environmental harms, but also as representatives of future generations to discuss the projections of delayed and cumulative impacts. I think David mentioned that some environmental harms tend to be or human rights impacts resulting from environmental harms like soil pollution or water pollution tend to be delayed or accumulated over time. Another very quick example, an agribusiness incorporated the right to healthy environment into its human rights policy, and in the human rights policy explicitly committed to integrating environmental restoration with human rights remediation. So when addressing impacts, should they occur, the business would merge the 2. Restoration of the environment plus remediation of human rights of affected communities. And lastly, just the real case, a private bank that we consulted at the global level used environmental and lived experience indicators, again, from the 2 worlds, to assess an investee's corrective actions before renewing ties and business relationships, to after this investee's connection to an abuse. So two types of indicators, one type that normally environmental teams use, and another type of indicators that normally human rights teams use. So let me stop here and over to you, Joanne, for another round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Olga. You've really laid it out very well. Thank you for setting us back in time to what the right to a healthy environment and the ratification at the UN General Assembly means for leveling the playing field or harmonizing the approaches which companies and other stakeholders have always worked on over the years and how it's inspiring new regulations. We're definitely keen on and observing regulations around the world, including in the EU context. And thanks very much for outlaying also the way that this approach to the right helps to break silos. Those examples you've shared at the end, they are really, really compelling and interesting, including around extraterritorial context, where companies like Natura & Co are working across many borders, including in the upstream supply chain, right? What that looks like and also downstream. Thanks for mentioning again future impacts and the example of intergenerational impacts, which are critical in this work of understanding human rights impacts, and of course those examples on combining data sets and combining expertise. Those are very interesting. I'll circle back to you, David, for a second kind of intervention. Of course, having heard from all our panelists so far, do you have examples of perhaps effective KPIs, key performance indicators that companies can set to track their protection of the right to a healthy environment? Do you have any insights you could share? Thank you. Over to you, David.
Yes, Joanne, definitely. Luckily, there are a lot of good examples for effective KPIs on tracking this interlinkage. And actually, KPIs, let me just say that they're crucial to actually monitor the effectiveness of a company's due diligence system. And they constitute a fundamental part of the due diligence system. So it's not a nice to have. It's something that should really be established when taking any measure in the context of the due diligence process. But also, depending on the exact scope of application, KPIs can differ in the way they are designed. For example, some KPIs, they focus more on the actual due diligence processes and the effectiveness of the process itself and the establishment of the process itself. Others, they focus more on the overall due diligence strategy. And again, others focus on the impact monitoring. And by impact monitoring, I really mean the effectiveness of preventive and remedial measures. And well, I can give some examples across these three categories for effective KPIs. For example, the process-based KPIs. Companies could, for example, track the percentage of project sites where environmental and human rights risk are jointly assessed, so where both parts are really taken into account. Or following up on the point that I mentioned earlier, the level of coordination between human rights and environmental teams, for example, through the assessment of joint committees or working groups within the company. On the strategic level, strategic KPIs could be the inclusion of the right to a healthy environment in the company's human rights policy or in a company's code of conduct, but also the number of stakeholder consultations specifically addressing this intersection of environmental and human rights concerns. Or another example, the percentage of suppliers assessed for compliance with both environmental and human rights standards. So that could be another potential KPI. But now let me come to the impact-focused KPIs. And I was really happy to hear that you, Marina, you already touched upon that subject and you really put a focus on it, because I really think that this is the really most important and most relevant KPI, though it's often underrepresented because it's so challenging to set up and come up with a KPI on really impact. But a potential impact focused KPI could be the reduction in community or worker exposure to specific environmental harms in high-risk areas. Well, of course, so the first step would be to really monitor and analyze the environmental harms, but then really develop a KPI that reflects this intersection. Or another example, the percentage of operations, companies' operations with no negative impact, or at least like a negligible impact on local access to clean water or air. Yeah, and as I said, this is really, in our view, the most important KPI, and I would almost say there the companies, they can really approach this with creativity. I mean, there are no limits set on how to really design those impact-oriented KPIs, and it could even make sense, as Marina did, to come up with some even more granular and disaggregated data and really take into account aspects like gender, specific regions, or the exposure to vulnerable groups. So there's a lot we can do on developing KPIs and come up with effective KPIs. But yeah, I think it remains a challenge.
David, wonderful. I think all participants here can see how much the help desk can be an ally in this work, because some of these things, are difficult to do, but also there are examples that we have that can be shared. So thank you for giving it so, succinctly in terms of strategic KPIs, process KPIs, and impact KPIs. Thank you so much. I'll switch now to you, Marina. Having heard from your colleagues on the panel, tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges you're faced in implementing these human rights due diligence actions to protect the right to a healthy environment. Over to you, Marina. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm actually relieved to see that both my colleagues already said most of my challenges I had here, they were already addressed, and I could see this is very a communal experience of those challenges, starting with one that the three of us already said, how we operate in silos here in Natura, for example. Even though we are under the same CSO, we have three technical expertise: human rights, people, nature, and climate. So putting our heads together was the first thing we had to do. So what we did, we created a strategy on regeneration, which is to regenerate, we have to demystify the silos and put our heads together, these three areas, these three technical areas. And aside from having the will to do, which we have, I think the second challenge is there is no framework, there's no common lenses on those topics. So when you talk about climate risk, you talk about the risk for the company. When we talk about human rights risk, we have the right to the people. So there is not a common lenses or framework that actually help us not move from will to the do. And the third one, I think, is, okay, once we created kind of our Frankenstein on how to do it, how to do the human rights due diligence with climate and so on, is how do we deliver this to the areas, to the risk management area, to compliance areas? So how do we take this very technical topic and bring it into the process of the company, and not having such clear frameworks or such clear processes made it a little bit harder as well. So different lenses, different process, and different frameworks. It's very hard to translate to internal process. If only human rights is already hard, putting everything together in a bowl and putting it to internal process was a little harder. And I do feel that this is not only related to the right to a healthy and clean environment, but to the whole topic on due diligence and human rights in general, is a huge gap from theory to practice. So I always tell my colleagues, my technical colleagues, it's beautiful sometimes what we draw and the process we draw, but living this, taking this to the action within in the middle of the Amazon, it's a completely different thing. So there's a huge gap between theory and practice that I do think we need to address as a group in general. So bringing UN, bringing Helpdesk, bringing companies together. So this panel, for example, for me, it's a good example of bringing our heads together to think and talk about those gaps, which bringing into the companies. It's a huge cost. It takes us a huge toll to actually implement those processes. So this gap needs to be closed, and we need to work together on this. And the fourth one, that I come from Brazil. I represent a Brazilian company that I do need to address whenever I get invited to panels. Is this gap is also very European centric. So listening to rights holder and listening to people that are actually impact, we need to shift the conversation to the global south as well. And I'm very aware to see that there's not many people from the global south discussing this and being in the panels and so on. So I think a huge step to closing the gap between theory and practice is bringing this to the global south, and where most of the supply chain is, most of the value chain is in general. So I think this would be a fourth challenge, because sometimes even finding information in Portuguese or Spanish or any other language mostly speaking in the global south is difficult. So human rights due diligence in Portuguese, there's not enough data, there's not enough material in Portuguese for me to talk to the communities and so on. So this is a challenge in general that I see. So I would be the fourth challenge I've seen. I mean, there are many others, but I think that those are the biggest ones we've faced so far.
Marina, you've really built upon the thought process here. Really appreciate you. And in the interest of time, we have just a few minutes to the top of the hour. But I really have picked up some very juicy information from you, Marina, including what I'll ask Olga next. Olga mentioned that the UNDP has done extensive consultations and research on, when developing this practical tool. Olga, over back to you. Please tell us a little bit more about the UNDP guide. Do you have some practical examples also of how a company can, navigate these challenges we've heard? Over to you, Olga. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Joan. So yeah, last year at the UN Business and Human Rights Forum in Geneva, UNDP launched our practical tool for business on human rights due diligence and the environment. So my colleague and I spent 2 years developing this tool, and we did it in consultation with more than 200 stakeholders across 5 continents. Marina, stakeholders in the Global South were extensively consulted. We consulted more than 80 multinational enterprises, including their supply chains in the Global South. So we wanted to collect real business experiences, good practices, but also challenges to overcome, and gather them in a very practical tool to move from why to how. Because this is really the gap. There are so many why tools, but the how, the practicality was missing, and that was the request that businesses constantly sent to UNDP. And in the past 2 years, we were working on this practical tool, collecting this data from around the world, and launched this tool at the forum last year. Well, the document is quite detailed, and I'll put the link in the chat. I know it's also available in the Navigator, and you can access it there. I wanted to highlight 3 key points that make it relevant to you, to businesses, regardless of where you are, regardless of your size, context you operate, etc. First of all, the tool frames environmental issues through the triple planetary crisis, that is pollution, climate change, and biodiversity loss. I know Christina presented the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment through a list of at least 8 issues, but we framed the guide through the triple planetary crisis just to show where businesses should start with, just where to prioritize, what to prioritize, where to avoid, what to avoid, where to start the respect to the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So this is the triple planetary crisis of pollution, climate change, and biodiversity loss and related human rights. Second, its dual focus on the triple planetary crisis and human rights helps companies navigate the ever-growing number of environmental and human rights standards and frameworks. This includes these endless abbreviations that I'm sure that businesses are tired of: the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, TISFD, Task Force on Inequality and Social-Related Financial Disclosures, ISO standards, International Financial Reporting Standards, IFRS, Science-Based Indicators, Greenhouse Gas Protocol. I can continue this list for hours, and companies need to navigate it, navigate this endless list, need to report and meet all the standards, and this list continues to grow. As well as companies need to meet national and regional reporting requirements on both the environment and human rights. For example, the EU Deforestation Regulation, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the upcoming Corporate Sustainability and Due Diligence Directive, etc. So because of this, dual focus of the triple planetary crisis and human rights of the guide, we hope that it will help companies navigate all this growing demands that come to them from this, ever-growing abbreviations coming from all ends, either from states or voluntary frameworks and standards. So the tool offers businesses a single unified process, and the process that businesses know from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights due diligence that Saskia presented. Regardless, again, of your company size, industry ownership, operational context, the approach is the same, HRDD, as identified is in UNGPs. But now with integrated environmental dimension. So by undertaking 4 steps of human rights due diligence, with integrating some environment here and there, all this standards, TCFD, TNFD, TISFD, ISO, can be met, and with one single approach. Of course, it's not that straightforward as Marina underlined, but at least it's one single process if it's done well. So to borrow a Tamil proverb, since I'd rather not kill 2 birds with 1 stone when discussing the right to healthy environment, this tool helps companies fulfill their responsibilities under the UNGPs, under the international human rights law, while complying with the growing array of standards, frameworks, and laws. So Tamil people say 1 stone, 2 mangoes. So this tool is about 1 stone and 2 mangoes. So to prevent and address adverse impacts on the right to a healthy environment, Joan, in your second half of the question, businesses should follow the four key steps of human rights due diligence per the UNGPs. I don't want to take time and explain again. I think Saskia did a great job in presenting the 4 steps plus human rights policy commitment and grievance mechanisms. So in the interest of time, I will not go again over these 4 steps, just to say human rights due diligence, again, is one stone, 2 mangoes, and it's going to be my key message for today. Thank you very much. Over to you, Joan. Thank you.
Excellent, Olga. And thank you, participants, for sticking it out. Very, very luckily, we did not have questions on the chat, which would be also welcome for participants to please write to us. We will shortly share our contact information, and of course we can all connect on LinkedIn as well, which is always a great go-to place. Here on the screen you'll see a QR code for you to access a Business and Human Rights Navigator and the web the PDF download publication that I mentioned earlier. Please feel free to scan this, and it will also be shared in the slide deck. So this webinar aimed to officially launch this publication, To a Right to a Healthy Environment, and your BHR Navigator is a helpful resource with plenty of reference documents, including the UNDP guide, the CSR risk checker, policy instruments, and so forth. If your company is not a member of the Global Compact, please join the initiative to access additional learning resources, but also to connect with other companies for peer-to-peer learning. We have an accelerator program to help you actually learn how to conduct human rights due diligence from start to the cyclical process ongoing. Please reach out to us also if you're in New York or in Geneva for the UN Forum, in New York for UN General Assembly on the 80th year. So here are our contact information. I want to take this very brief last minute to thank our panelists, David, Marina, and Olga, for your time and great insights, valuable information. I want to thank you, Christina, as well at the Maplecroft for all the support in the Navigator project. Thank you, Jesse, and all your colleagues behind the scenes who made this webinar come to life for us, and of course, my colleague Saskia. This webinar recording will be sent to registered participants and also made available on demand on the UN Global Compact Academy platform. Please join the Global Compact again if you'd like to learn more information. I will quickly skip to next slide as we conclude. All right, I think that's the end of our slide deck. We had a poll question, but we are definitely out of time at this moment in time. We really look forward to hearing from participants. And thank you once again, all of our panelists and our support team. With that, I wish to, on behalf of the partnership, close off this webinar. I'm so sorry I couldn't get to our last poll question, but if you have any actions you'd like to take as a company, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Have you picked on anything, and are you interested to learn more? Thank you all so much, and have a very good rest of your day.
Thank you too. Bye.